I'm Rabbi Sarah Berman. I know many of you, but not all of you. I am the Director of Jewish Culture and Programming here at Central, and I'm so glad that you are joining us this evening. I'm here with my colleagues this evening, Dr. Shira Epstein behind the camera, and Rabbi Hilly Haber, give a wave in the back. And this evening, we are, all three of us, so happy to welcome you to the very beginning of the High Holy Day season. Slichot, our service tonight, our penitential prayers, open up the holiday season for us in a really specific way. Coming into these holidays, we are all carrying the traumas of the last year. We're carrying the grief and the pain of the losses we have suffered. And we're also carrying the joys of everything wonderful that has happened to us as well. So it's a complicated set of feelings that we're carrying with us. Reflective of everything that we are carrying, our congregation, our clergy team, wanted to ask all of you a couple of questions as we enter the High Holy Day season. What was uprooted for you this past year, and what are you grieving? And what would you like to plant in the coming year? How do you want to heal? And so to help us explore those questions and ideas around post-traumatic growth, we have a special speaker this evening, one of my very favorite teachers, Dr. Betsy Stone. Betsy is a retired psychologist who is very bad at being retired. A recovering retiree, yes. Betsy has a passion for wellness in the lives of families, and this has brought her invitations to teach throughout North America and Europe. She leads groups for clergy, including myself, as we navigate the complexities of our personal and professional roles. And she teaches as a scholar in residence for congregations and clergy groups, and teaches clergy in formation at HUCJIR, the Reform Rabbinical Cantorial Education and Professional School. Betsy's topics of real expertise include how we carry trauma in our brains and bodies, and post-traumatic growth, as well as many, many other topics. And tonight, we have Betsy to learn from and to speak with and to ask questions of on these topics. Betsy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? I have a big voice, but I know I'm required to use this. I want to start with a request and a caveat. The request is that we do this as a dialogue. I promise you I have taught this material many times, and I know what I want to say, but I want to make sure that we go where you want to go. And so really feel free to ask me questions, to interrupt, to say you're wrong. Somebody told me recently when I used that expression with a group that I'm working with in Canada, they said, oh, I'm sorry, Canadians don't interrupt. You are not Canadians, most of you. So please interrupt and make sure that the time is useful for you. That's all of our goals.
The only request I would make is if you do interrupt with a question, just wait till I bring the mic to you so our friends on Zoom can hear the question as well.
Great, great. So what we're planning on talking about tonight, but you may take me down a tangent and we may never get back there, who knows, is something that's called post-traumatic growth in psychological literature. It starts with a mistake, because there is no such thing as post-trauma. When you have a traumatic experience, it stays in your body and your brain for your lifetime. And so when we talk about something like post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic growth or recovery from grief, these are things that don't actually happen. And part of the reason they don't happen is because grief and trauma are stored in a part of your brain that has no language, which means you can't talk yourself out of it. And what they end up doing is popping up like a whack-a-mole, whether you expect them to or not. And And they don't have to be horrible traumas to do that. So I'll give you an example. This is a relatively trivial example. I was driving on the West Side Highway, and I was listening to 880, and I was because I wanted to know what the traffic and weather were, and I heard the little jingle, and somebody rear-ended me, and I was really scared. Okay, he was fine ultimately. I was fine completely. I was just really scared. Literally the next time I heard that jingle, I burst into tears. That's a manifestation of not a big trauma, but a little trauma, that my brain said, oh, that music is dangerous. And that is the kind of way, that's the way that trauma and grief pop up again for us, even when we're not expecting them. So I'm going to use the expression post-traumatic growth because it's what's in the literature, and I understand what they mean, but I feel like I need to warn you that that's not actually, it's a misnomer. The second thing I want to tell you about trauma before we talk about post-traumatic growth is that not all traumas are bad. We think of trauma as being something terrible. But in fact, in psychological literature, we believe that the birth of a first child is the traumatic equivalent of the death of a parent. Wow. Well, if you think about what happens with the birth, by the way, subsequent children are bupkis, nobody cares about them. But what happens with the birth of a first child, birth or adoption, of a first child, is that your relationship to yourself changes. The way you see yourself in the world changes. The way the world responds to you changes. And all of those things can be part of something which is traumatic. Last thing I'm going to talk to you about, two more things I want to tell you about trauma. I'm bad at this. Anybody who's ever learned with me knows that I say this is the last, and then I keep going. Trauma's not the event, it's the response to the event. It's not the event, it's the response to the event. So there may be something that happens to you and me standing together in a moment that for one of us is traumatic and the other is not. And one of the great predictors of whether or not something is traumatic is my own history of trauma. So the longer my history of trauma, the more quickly I respond as though a new event is trauma. Was that English? Nod your heads. Okay. The other thing that I think is important for us to know about trauma is, writ large, is that we all have coping skills in our lives. And one of the things that happens when our coping skills don't work is that we do them more. So that I say to myself, this isn't working, I'll escalate it. So I don't know what coping skills, for example, you used during lockdown. If you are a person who uses online shopping as a coping mechanism, I hear that there are some of us in the room, that escalated during lockdown. If you're a person who uses alcohol as a coping mechanism, that escalated during lockdown. As a matter of fact, in the first month of lockdown, and the number is a little deceptive because restaurants and bars were closed, but in the first month of lockdown, there was a 40% increase in alcohol sales in the United States. And women's alcohol use escalated at to a much higher level than men's did. So women are now drinking as much as men have historically been drinking. So there are lots of things that are important for us to know about trauma as we begin to think about what it is that happens to me as the emergency part of the trauma diminishes. And I think one of the things that's important for us to know is that often when the emergency part of the trauma diminishes, the emotional parts start. So, for example, one of the things that I've worked with with your clergy is the idea that loss and grief are different. That loss is a lot of the practical stuff we do after a death. We buy a casket, we figure out who's bringing food for Shiva, stuff like that. That's loss, it's not grief. And so what happens after, when the trauma looks like it's kind of pausing, is all the emotional reaction. Okay? Okay, so what happens ultimately, what happens in psychological research areas is that somebody gets really interested in an idea. And there were a number of psychologists in different places. They got really interested in this idea that people can come through trauma and benefit from it. Now, nobody would say trauma is good for us. I'm not suggesting that. But what I'm suggesting is that there are things that we learn, skills that we learn, things that we learn about ourselves that are responsive to having had a major disruption. And what I want us to focus on right now is what those skills might be. That we believe that about 10% of people have post-traumatic stress disorder, which I think is really remarkable given how much attention it gets in media, et cetera. And around 50% of people have something that's called post-traumatic growth. The researchers who look at post-traumatic growth say that there are 6 distinct silos, 6 distinct ways that we manifest this. My brain is not good at silos, and so I'm a little mushy as I describe this, but what I'd like to do is to talk to you about what those 6 silos are. And I want to suggest to you, I want to tell you very clearly, nobody does all of them. You can't get an A at post-traumatic growth, even if you're really smart. And you will most likely find that there's 1 or 2 of these that are really kind of your instinctual go-to responses. And those are the ones that really you're hardwired for or they work for you. It doesn't really matter which. But you won't finish them because human beings don't finish growth. That would be a tragedy, I think. So what we're going to do now is talk about these 6 different arenas of post-traumatic growth. I'm going to ask you to give me examples because I think it's really what's useful about the information is not what I tell you about it, but how it applies for you. So in no particular order, the first time I taught this, I forgot to say nobody does all of them, and I was working with not yours, but a group of clergy, and somebody said, "Oh no, I only got 5." You don't get 5. So don't expect too much of yourself. None of us really do. So in no particular order. The first form of post-traumatic growth is a greater appreciation of life. Now, think about this in terms of, we could think about this in terms of communal trauma, or we could think about this in terms of individual trauma. The difference between communal trauma and individual trauma is that communal trauma changes the trajectory of history, and individual trauma changes the trajectory of a life. Likely, communal trauma includes individual trauma, although there are people who say, it didn't bother me, it didn't impact me. But likely, communal trauma includes individual trauma. And an example of changes the trajectory of history, of course, we can't know what history would have been without a particular trauma, but I think I could make an argument that without the Holocaust, the UN would not have ratified the State of Israel. I'm not sure that would have made that much difference ultimately historically. I think we could make an argument that without the pandemic, Trump might have been reelected. And so again, it's a communal trauma that changes the trajectory of history. But what we're really talking about here is individual trauma and how individual trauma changes us. What parts of us we learn about that we wouldn't have known otherwise or might not have been as relevant. So the first one was greater appreciation of life. Give me an example of that. I can do it. Right. Okay. You go there. I'll go here. You go there. Okay. Hi. Go ahead.
When my husband died, I felt that he had died so that I could live.
Oh, wow. When my husband died, I felt he had died so I could live. So what what happens for you is that then there is an expansion of possibility. Lovely, lovely. Other ideas? You have one here?
I faced cancer. I faced cancer twice, and the first time my daughter was 13, and I was bound and determined to be there for her. And the second time was a total surprise, and I was saying, I want to live on.
Right, so you say to yourself in partial response to the trauma, I am not going to die now, right? And it's not that we necessarily have the power to make that happen, but it is clearly, is that a hand coming up? Yeah. It is clearly an appreciation of life. Yes, lovely.
I feel blessed, and I changed my career, and I now help others.
So this is going to fit in a different category because your brain isn't siloed either. But it is an appreciation, absolutely. We might see things like a pause to consider nature, for example. Like the crocuses are more beautiful. But we might also see this. There is a very old Jewish tradition that liberal Jews don't do. I don't know, do conservative Jews do this? Where when you've survived a terrible danger, you change your name. Wow, like, wow. Did you change your name?
No, I didn't, but it's a good idea. Some people do a mikvah, it's also a new beginning. So this is both communal and personal, but I think after October 7th and the ensuing anti-Semitism, the response of many, and I know personally I felt this as well as our community, was to live more Jewishly and to be more Jewish. Is that a different category?
It might be. But it's one of the things that we're seeing. So I have not seen any data on this. I've only heard anecdotal data, but all the anecdotal data I keep hearing is that that people are doing more Jewish, which is not necessarily the same as going to synagogue, and that lots of people that we would have historically called Jewish adjacent, a partner of somebody who's not Jewish but who's the partner is Jewish, that there's been a real increase in, anecdotally, in people going for conversion. I don't know if that's happening here. Okay, I'm going to take two more. Here's one more, and then I'm going to go to the next one because Rabbi Berman's going to yell at me about my timing. No, okay, she's just going to slap the microphone out of my hand.
I don't know, am I speaking?
Yeah.
I don't know what category this is, but I think from the traumas that I suffered, it's made me more sensitive to other people, and it's affected in a good way my writing. I'm able to talk about things and have characters speak about things because I know them personally, and it's helped other people.
So that falls into two other categories, and we'll come to them. You guys, you all are fabulous. Okay, last one. You have to wear a hat? Oh, yes.
So I never wanted to stand out. I never wanted to make a public statement. I never talked about politics publicly. And my response to October 7th, you see, and I wear it all the time, no matter where I am.
So this is a deepening of identity. This is a deepening of identity. Okay, I'm going to keep going. I apologize. I will try, as I ask for more examples. You're in charge of me.
So Paula adds to our conversation that when she was diagnosed with breast cancer, the next day she went and signed a 5-year lease on a new car. She was just determined to be here 5 years later.
When my grandmother was in her 80s, we bought her a 10-year electric blanket, and she made us return it because she said she wasn't planning on being here that long. She lived into her late 90s. Okay, second one. greater appreciation of close relationships and a diminishing interest in not close relationships. So the example that makes the most sense to me here is around COVID. We know that early in COVID, there was an internationally, which I was surprised by, a huge increase in divorce almost immediately, that people said, you're not who I'm going to live with. And that wasn't just in the United States, it was in China, it was in India, it wasn't in places where divorce is illegal, but there was an almost immediate increase in the divorce rate. And I think we also saw a change in our understanding of who really were important people in our lives. Think about the people that you went out to lunch with before COVID that you haven't spoken to since. And there are lots of those people in our lives. Those were people who filled time, but didn't actually necessarily create meaning. The other piece of this, in terms of close relationships and kind of distancing myself from relationships that don't really matter that much and intensifying the relationships that do, by the way, in the first month after vaccinations, the vast majority of people historically travel for business. In the first month after vaccinations, the vast majority of us travel to see family and friends. Duh. Right? We see increases in three other kinds of things. And I think this may be where I went with you. We see increases in kindness, compassion, and altruism. Now, those things sound like they're the same, but they're absolutely not the same. So my example will be with, I'm walking down the street and there's a homeless person and he wants money. If I am kind, I do something for him or her. I go to Dunkin' Donuts and get them a sandwich. I offer them something. I give them money. I do something. That's an act of kindness. I can be thinking to myself, you are disgusting. You smell so bad. All sorts of things. But I'm kind. If I'm compassionate, I walk down the street, I see that same person, I say to myself, I feel so badly for you. I don't have to do anything. I can be compassionate without being kind. I can be kind without being compassionate. And altruism is, I walk down the street, I say to myself, there should not be homeless people in New York City. I'm going to volunteer at an organization. I'm going to donate to people who work with the homeless. I could be unkind and uncompassionate, but be altruistic. I can obviously be all three, but I don't have to be one. They're not all the same.
I think you make a great point, but with me, I'm kind and compassionate, but my comment was I really do feel blessed, and I want to give back because I almost feel lucky.
Yep.
So I think that's a little different.
It might be. It might be a little different. And we actually know that simply doing things which are kind, not necessarily compassionate, kicks off endorphins in our brains. So if you ask me to make a $10 donation, I give you $10. Even if I'm thinking, God, she drives me crazy, my brain will kick off endorphins, and those make me feel good. Okay. Can anybody, do I have time? Well, I have 4 more things to do. Okay. Anybody want to give me an example of a change in close relationships? You don't have to tell me that you got divorced or that you got much closer to somebody, because I've already covered those. Anything else? All right. Okay. Thank you.
Hello. You mentioned earlier that the birth of your first child is considered trauma.
Birth or adoption?
Or adoption. Well, 2 weeks ago, I welcomed the birth of my first child, and
Mazal
there is an you instantly notice how much closer I am, not just to my wife, but just which friends I wanted to share the good news with and to send pictures, and the friends that I was like, I will get to them whenever. They'll find out. They'll see it on Instagram.
So this is a great example, and Mazal Tov, and I hope you're sleeping a little bit. Sleep's overrated. It's really, what you've given yourself is a feedback loop, right? Where you said to yourself, both, these are the people that matter to me, and these are the people to whom I matter. And that feedback loop is a kind of narrowing of relationships to the ones that are most important, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. We should all have hierarchies of relationships. It would be foolish to say everybody in the world matters to me the same amount. That would just be dumb. Don't be dumb.
There's one comment in the Zoom room that Ed, he got much closer to his daughter after her mother passed away.
Yes, because the relationship either becomes more important, or the importance of the relationship is illuminated more. Okay, one example here.
After the loss of my second sibling, I created a family reunion every year so that we all could become closer and get to know each other better in terms of the relationships. It just was, I don't think I would have done that otherwise.
Okay, so here's a greater appreciation of life and a deepening of relationships, and an intentional deepening of relationships. They don't just deepen. You say, this matters to me. I'm going to make sure this happens. Lovely. Okay, and then I'm going to go to the third one.
I had friends, and after the pandemic, I made sure they knew each other, and we have become a family. 6 people, care for each other, now are very close. In the beginning, everybody didn't know each other, but we need a family.
So you not only deepened relationships, but at some level you picked relationships for deepening, and said, these are the people I want to be in my narrow circle. Absolutely. Lovely. Okay, I'm going to go to number 3. Remember, this is in no order whatsoever, okay? The third one is an identification of new possibilities in life. This is the one you did. This is the one you did, where you say to yourself, something happened to me that I need to respond to, and I need to say, I need to increase, higher prioritize it. That's not English. And we see this a lot in response to real disruption, to real trauma. Mothers Against Drunk Driving comes directly out of trauma. Like, you could not make a more direct link. The March for Our Lives kids who were exposed to school violence in Parkland, it comes directly out of that experience. Would they have done that at some other time later in their lives? Who knows? But what happens, one of the things that can happen in response to trauma is that I say to myself, this is more important than I knew. And I'm going to change, again, the trajectory of my life because of this thing. So I'm curious if people have examples of this. Yours, which was a perfect example. I knew eventually I'd get to it. Other examples of ways in which a trauma, a major disruption changes. Yeah, I'm coming. Okay, you're going.
Yeah, I would say, not to get too political, but after the 2016 election,
millions
and millions of people now are grassroots activists.
Yeah.
We all changed our lives significantly as a result of that trauma.
Yes. Yes, I think that is absolutely true. And it's after the 2016 election, people became more politically active, potentially. Surely we all bought pink hats. Some of us knitted pink hats. But what we said was, I can't trust that my beliefs and my needs are going to be cared for, I have to act. Absolutely. And I think that has happened again with the response, with the overturning of Roe, which I think is going to have a political impact, hopefully. Anybody else, or should I go on? Yes.
I'm not quite sure how to put this, but I found that throughout my life, I tended to think more towards what does the other person need and not thinking about my own. And I
Are
did
you
that
female?
for so long. What?
I said, are you female?
I'm Jewish.
It's a double whammy.
And when I was, and then when the time came that I was thoroughly betrayed by the people I thought I could trust, that's when as much as I still want to give, and I love to give because I love to shamashim, I love to do all those things, I started thinking about what I need to give to myself.
Yep.
And being more selfish about my needs as a human being.
Oh, you've just used two
And
words
it's
that I
trauma.
cannot let go
It's a
by.
trauma, so.
You've used two words that I can't let go by because I think they're so important. The first one is trust. We tend to think about trust as binary. Either I trust you or I don't trust you. I think that's nonsense. I trust you with certain things and not with other things. And that is really the way human relationships work. Even the people I trust the most, I don't trust 100% because that's not smart, right? So I think we confuse ourselves with the trust, don't trust binary. It feels very adolescent to me in the way that we think about things.
You feel like if you're supposed to trust someone, you have an obligation to trust them completely. And that's just not practical.
It's not practical. It's not the way human beings operate, right? So I hope, trust that I am trying to communicate something useful to you, but I don't see any of you handing me all of your credit cards, right? because you shouldn't. The other word that you use that I really think is an enormously challenging word is the word selfish. Again, we think selfishness is binary. Either I'm selfish or I'm not selfish. And I think that the people in my life who are completely unselfish are really irritating. Because, I say to you, what do you want for dinner? And you say, whatever you want. Well, that's actually not an answer to my question, right? I actually want you, and then most likely if I say I want Italian, you're going to say, oh, I was thinking Chinese. And now I'm screwed, right? Because I don't want Chinese, or I feel set up. I think that people who tell us what they want are much easier to deal with. I say to my children, I want a list of Hanukkah presents you want. That doesn't mean I'm going to get you what you want, but it surely makes it more likely that I'm going to be successful. And my goal is to be successful. It's not to give you what I want. But if you don't tell me what you want, I'm much more likely to give you what I want, because that's what I think you should want. Because it's what I want, and I'm so smart and the center of the universe.
So I want to say something about trust and selfish. The thing about trust is based on experience.
Absolutely.
If someone is always does what they say they're going to do, you trust them. And that's the reason why many of us have difficulty with trusting God, because we don't have a clue what God's going to do.
And God won't tell us.
Right. Now, selfish. Buber argued that everything that we do is selfish. If you give tzedakah, it seems like an unselfish act. If you give the highest level of tzedakah, where you don't know who it's going to and they don't know who's getting it, it's the highest level. But why is it selfish? It makes you feel good. You gave tzedakah to feel good.
Right. And so we can't say to ourselves, if I do something, if I take the parking space that I think you might be behind me looking for. Am I a bad person? And that's my issue with the word selfish, is I think we use it as though anything I do that's not selfless is selfish. I think people who are completely selfless are really hard to deal with. All right, I'm going to keep going, because I think I've only done 3. Am I right? Nah, I did personal strengths. Okay, then I've only done 3. Greater awareness of personal strengths. What am I able to do? What skills do I have? What can I rely on myself for? What did you learn that you could rely on yourself for in the pandemic? What did you learn that you could rely on yourself for after October 7th? I actually think this is not only what I learned I could rely on myself for, but what I learned I could rely on other people for, which is partly what I learned I could outsource, right? That I could say, I don't have to be good at this because you are. This could go from the sublime to the ridiculous. Michelle Obama learned how to knit. I'm a knitter. I think that's a personal strength. We all learned how to use technology that was beyond us before. That's a personal strength. But I also might have learned, and I'm not going to ask you for examples on this one because I'm really looking at the clock. We also learn about kindness is an example of a personal strength. Compassion is an example of a personal strength. And so while they fit in a different silo, if I begin to say to myself, these are things about me that I like, they become personal strengths. Okay, number 5. I like this one a lot because it's the one I get to say, I haven't got an ounce of this. And one of the ways we see post-traumatic growth is in creativity. Think about rap music or hip-hop music as a manifestation, a response to trauma. Think about Picasso's Guernica as a response to trauma. Think about Jewish history post the destruction of the temple as a response to trauma, because we are no longer making sacrifices at the temple. The creativity is a way in which I show myself and other people, it's a way in which I digest trauma by taking it outside of my own experience and putting it out in the world. You can come up with lots of ways to, Hilly, you've got a visitor. You can come up with lots of ways in which you can understand creativity as a manifestation of trauma. The last one, the last one is one that I think is really interesting. It is spiritual growth. I need to parse for you spirituality and religiosity. They are not the same thing. So we see people having different kinds of conversations about and with God. I think we might see, there are different times in our lives where we are really much more open to spiritual experience. And remember, I'm not talking about liturgical experience. And they are, when we're toddlers, when we're adolescents. One of the things I think is fascinating about that is that we rarely talk to adolescents about their spiritual lives, and they are living incredibly spiritual lives. As we approach death and in response to a crisis. Those are the times, the moments when spirituality really kind of becomes more intense for us. In response to a trauma, lots of people have spiritual experiences. It may be that you smell your grandmother's smell at a moment when she's been dead for 10 years. And you say, oh, there she is. It may be that I think one of the ways we're seeing this in the Jewish community right now, post October 7th, is in a heightened Jewish identity, a heightened sense of it is really important to me that not only that I'm Jewish, but that you know how important this is to me. But we see changes in spirituality as a response to trauma. Can anybody give me an example of that before we move on?
I actually want to ask a question about that, the spiritual experiences.
Yeah.
Does that include both embracing the spiritual and rejecting the spiritual? I think
Absolutely.
of the Holocaust, where so many survivors came out and said, God wanted me to live, so I'm going to live in this way. And so many others came out and said, there cannot be a God who allowed this to happen to so many people. My surviving is a fluke, and there cannot be a God that exists.
And people who said, my survival is a fluke, and I need God in a different way than I did before. So all of those, yes. Spiritual growth doesn't necessarily mean growth towards God. It could be growth away from God. But growth away from God is, in some sense, a statement about God and my relationship with God. Right? No? Argue with me. I love arguing.
Well, I ran into these people who were Jewish who said that they were really angry about what was going on in Israel, and actually they were embarrassed by being Jewish. And for me, that's them giving up their identity.
Oh, okay.
And that's not spiritual.
No, it's not spiritual, and identity doesn't have to be spiritual. And I think, so do you want me, can I do this? One of the things that we're seeing in data right now that I think is really important for people like me who are old to understand is that the relationship between American Jews and Israel is generationally bound. I grew up with an Israel that was never again. I grew up with an Israel that was weak and that needed to be protected, and it needed my blood, sweat, tears, money, whatever. That was the Israel I grew up with. My children grew up with an Israel that had nuclear power. That's a completely different experience. And I think part of the reason we're seeing so many intergenerational struggles about Israel is because... Okay. I think part of the reason we see so many intergenerational struggles about Israel has to do with the fact that we're not talking about the same place. I'm gonna hold this. You and I could talk about this later. Okay. So my job now is to ask you for questions or comments before we give you a task.
So I have a question about what you just said about smelling your grandmother's perfume versus having a more Jewish identity. One seems like more spiritual, like you can't explain it, and one is a little more logical.
So I'll argue with you about whether or not Jewish identity is logical. I'm not sure it's more thinking. I think there have been many times in our history where logical people would have turned away.
I guess what I'm asking is more about the smelling of the grandmother's perfume, how tragedy or trauma could have that happen.
So a couple of thoughts here. First of all, the sense of smell is the most primitive sense that we have, and so it's kind of the most, therefore the most irrational one. Does that make sense? And so we often get deja vu in relationship to a smell. When my oldest was starting kindergarten, I walked into a school building with her. We didn't go to school in the same state. And it smelled just the same. And I had this, like, I'm a little girl response. That's one of the things that smell does. But I'm not only talking about those kind of aha moments. I'm talking about this sense of there being meaning that I don't understand, or there being bigger questions than I necessarily thought I needed to think about, which I think actually for lots of us is part of the post-October 7th experience. It may not look like I want to go to worship. It may look like there's something cooking inside me that I don't quite get, which is probably also happening to you all the time right now, because there's something cooking inside you that you don't quite get, and that's not a bad thing. So, Rabbi Haber.
Thank you. We're gonna take a few minutes to continue the conversation, but in Hevruta pairs. So we have our. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I can help too. We have our reflection questions on the cover, and then also a few poems to bring into the conversation. But if you want to turn to your neighbor, the person next to you, your table, and really take a minute to discuss these questions in light of the 6 forms of post-traumatic growth that we just heard about from Dr. Stone, and also to check out the poetry, and also something just to take with you into this season as well.